we're looking now at what we would usually call the central image or the kind of climax of this poem. But this is where you have to be quite flexible with the way you think about these poems. You know, generally you want to think of these three moments as a moment from the opening, a central moment of tension from the middle, and then the conclusion of the text, because it gives you a chance to talk about the way the poet's attitude has changed. But what you will see in this poem is that the poem ends on a climax. It ends on unresolved tension. That we see the police coming for the speaker, but we don't actually find out what occurs to him. Of course, we are left to fill in the missing information with our gruesome imagination. But what we then have to do is treat the second and third moments, the abduction of Dan Laddie and the abduction of Chinwe, really as just an extension of the opening. And so what we really have in this poem is a really long, static opening and then a moment of climax. But of course, it's only a long, static opening because the speaker's understanding doesn't develop in the first three moments. And it only shows some sign of change in that climactic moment of unresolved tension. And so really we have to think of this middle whole section, these two repetitions of abductions, as extensions of the introduction, really. So the central part of this poem, again, is really an extension of the speaker's state of mind in the opening. So we wouldn't really call this the climax necessarily, but it's the central component of the poem. So again, we start off with "They came one night." Again, the language that's used, the pronouns, and the times that are used to mark the dictatorship's actions are very vague. And so we, as readers, are distanced from their actions, which is important because the distancing is what allows the speaker to not feel guilty. If you distance yourself from events and concerns, that is in the end what stops you from feeling guilty and feeling like you should take an active involvement in this. They came one night. This vague language that's used to describe these violent instruments of the state is very deliberately vague, and it's reflective of the speaker's attempt to distance himself from the events. And that, I think, is highlighted again then by this dramatic verb. They booted the whole house awake. Now this is a very important echo, I think, in totalitarian literature that is about totalitarian regimes, because it's a dramatic verb, but it reminds us of the phrase the jackboot, which is symbolic really of fascism and Nazi Germany, particularly the shoes that were worn by many of Hitler's kind of brown shirts. But this also deliberately gives us an echo of George Orwell and his novel 1984, who famously writes that his image is of a boot pressed on the image of someone's face forever and ever. You know, that extremely symbolic ending to 1984 that is a symbol of the power of totalitarian regimes. So that word on its own contains this particular echo of fascist repression. But it also personifies its actions. They booted the whole house awake, which is a way of emphasizing its power. So this personification here, that the house itself is booted awake. The house wakes. It hugely emphasizes the physical power of the regime and the violence that they're capable of. So it massively emphasizes this physical power. They can boot an entire house awake. Then they dragged Dan Laddie out. And I think this is a rare moment where you have an interesting kind of repetition of a letter, an alliterative repetition of D. And this particular type of alliteration is quite literally punchy. Don't use that word necessarily in your analysis because it's not formal enough. But it is strongly accented alliteration that I think suggests the violence of the action that it describes. They dragged Dan Laddie out. It's very clearly punctuated and violent in its connotation. And then we have this final statement, and then off to a lengthy absence. Now, this isn't exactly figurative language, so it's not quite right to call it such, but it is what we would call a euphemism. It is a way of expressing a difficult idea and couching it in more comfortable language that's easier to confront. A lengthy absence. This person has been taken away and killed, is the implication here, but we're calling it an absence. So this single noun that's used here, the absence, is a euphemistic way of describing death. But again, it shows us the speaker's state of mind, the speaker's attempt to convince himself that everything is okay. He's trying to distance himself from these atrocities, and then his sense of personal responsibility. And his static state of mind is reflected here. We have that same question that is asked at the end of every stanza. What business of mine is it, so long as they don't take the yam from my savouring mouth? Then we move on to Chinwe. Chinwe went to work one day, only to find her job was gone. And now there's again, the repetition of someone on first name terms. So we find out who this Chinwe character is. Again, another friend. And I think, again, the tone here is quite jaunty. It seems upbeat. It almost sounds like the beginning of a fairy tale. Chinwe went to work one day, only to find her job was gone. And so the tone moves from jaunty to distressed very quickly. It's a very quick change in tone, only to find her job was gone. And again, what you'll notice here is what's called in grammar the passive voice. The job was gone, not they had fired her. We don't know who's made this happen. And again, it makes the violence and the crime faceless. The violence and the crime is faceless because we don't know why her job was gone and who was responsible for it, only to find her job was gone. Not the business had fired her because of pressure from the dictatorship. That immediately makes it very transparent what's going on. So again, it makes the violence faceless and it distances the speaker from having a deliberate understanding of what's happening in this particular moment. Then we have the repetition in 3, which is called formally tricolon sometimes. But you can call it a rule of 3 or a triplet. It's a repetition 3 times. Tricolon is usually used for 3 different adjectives. No query, no warning, no probe. No one asked any questions, no one warned Chinwe that this was going to happen, and no one bothered to find out why. So that tricolon there emphasizes the passive community response to this injustice. So it emphasizes the passive community response to this injustice. No query, no warning, no probe. And then there's a really clever line, I think it's one of the most intelligent in the whole poem. Just one neat sack for a stainless record. This whole line relies upon taking this word, which we use metaphorically to describe someone's performance at work, and re-literalizing it, turning it back into an object. So it's actually, in many ways, the reverse of a symbol. You know, it's a literal metaphor in some ways that's reversed. So we take someone's record to mean their history at a job, their performance, but here, this line turns it into something physical. It takes that abstract concept of someone's performance at work and turns it into something physical that can be put in one neat sack. And this object here functions as what we would call a metonym. It is a physical entity that stands for something that it connects to. And I think it is a metonymic representation of death itself. It can also be the bag that people use to gather up their belongings after they're fired. But I think it has a much more sinister connotation, the one neat sack for a stainless record. And the irony, of course, here, the neat sack matches the stainlessness of the record. So it seems appropriate somehow. The irony here is that this neat bag that is used to metaphorically contain this person's record and drag it away is just as neat as their stainless record. So there's an irony involved there. And then again, we have the repeated question. What business of mine is it so long as they don't take the yam from my savouring mouth? And that repetition of those lines is really, really important. We'll talk about that more when we talk about the structure and form.